Hello and welcome to this Chatham House seminar on Southeast Asia, seeking balance amid US-China rivalry. Thank you for joining us. My name is Bill Hayton and I'm an Associate Fellow with the Asia Pacific Programme here at Chatham House, and I'll be chairing the discussion. And this is the first event in a three-part series being held in partnership with Japan House London. That's the Japanese Cultural Centre here in the UK. Two further events will take place in the new year. One will be online and one will be at Japan House in West London. This event is taking place on the record and it will be recorded and will go up later on the Chatham House website. You're very welcome to submit questions to our four panelists throughout the event using the Zoom Q&A function down the bottom, and this will be fed directly to me and then I'll ask your questions to the panelists. Please note that if you submit any questions to the chat or through the raise hand function, we will not see those. So I'll introduce our panelists now. We have four panelists joining today. Alphabetically, they are Nobuo Aizawa, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Cultural Studies at Kyushu University in Japan, from where he joins us. He specializes in Southeast Asian politics, and among other topics, he's written on the geopolitical impact of English-speaking elites in Southeast Asia. Ben Bland is the director of the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House. He was previously at the Lowy Institute in Australia, and before that, a journalist with the Financial Times in Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Hong Kong. Kath Jones is a lecturer in the School of International Relations at the University of St Andrews, where she teaches and researches issues of security and development in East Asia. And Ivy Kwek is the Justra Fellow for China at the International Crisis Group, currently based in Taipei. She was previously a policy aide at the Ministry of Defense in Malaysia. So welcome to all four of you. Thank you for joining us. Can I begin with a question to all of you, although I'll ask Nobu to begin. How concerned are you about the impact of rivalry between the United States and China on Southeast Asia?
Yes, thank you very much. There's one point that I'm very concerned about, which is the decline of regional interest. I'm not that worried about national interest because every country in Southeast Asia has their way to navigate through geopolitical tensions. They're very savvy in doing so. They have the history to do so. But looking back the past 30 years, Southeast Asia has been a relatively peaceful region. And I think I can attribute to that with the understanding of the regional interest, not just only the national interest. But when we look at the last ASEAN summit in Jakarta, Indonesia run its chair with the slogan of epicentrum of growth, highly focused on economics, didn't touch upon politics. I think that was the very worrisome sign, because in the ASEAN arena, it looks like the political issues is becoming a high-hanging fruit, even more so. Case in point is Myanmar, of course, but South China Sea as well. They did not want to touch on those issues. I wouldn't attribute the case only on US-China rivalry because this is a post-COVID recovery time. So I understand the focus of economy is very important, but I think when Indonesia is chairing, which is the de facto leader of the region, this was the time, 2023 was the time that you can talk about high-hanging fruits, but it didn't. And I think it's the impact comes from the rivalry, because regional security issue can be easily a global geopolitical issues. So it unnecessarily, from the Southeast Asian point of view, kind of put the stakes higher. It becomes more difficult to manage. Therefore, the regional interests are shoved aside. So every countries will pursue much more in a national interest, which could diverge in their interests. So that's the biggest worrisome that I have.
Right, thank you. Kath, can I come to you next? What do you think? Are you worried?
So I suppose my issue is, so I've got three things that I'm sort of concerned about. One is, so I would just differ from Nobu a little bit in that I actually think one of the things that the experience of Southeast Asia during the Cold War taught us was if economics can cling you together, or if just protecting your national interests helps you to avoid getting drawn into conflicts, enables you to maintain your independence, then that's the pragmatic thing to do. And so I suppose I'm less concerned about ASEAN not necessarily being able to still engage with, at least publicly, still engage with some of the political issues. So I suppose I would differ a little bit from Nobu in that sense. What I'm maybe more concerned about is sort of looking to Olivia Chung's work on China and decision-making and factionalism. I'm a little bit more concerned about that, because it seems like there is a movement, that there is a centralization of certain decisions away from policy experts who have been handling certain issues for a very long time. And I sort of think that that raises my concerns in relation to the policy emanating from China. I'm also concerned about what's coming out of the US, and particularly the effects of the next US election. And what that might look like, and the implications, not just of the outcome of the election, but how that's going to affect all of the next sort of 9 months of states anticipating what could be. And actually that introducing a large uncertainty to everybody's decision making that is going to make the next 9 months potentially a lot more difficult to predict in terms of how states are going to act or react. But I would also say I do wonder how helpful it is to consider concern, because one of the things of Southeast Asia is that they've got the tyranny of geography. They can't escape this region. And so one way or another, they're going to have to sort of wheedle their own path through. And I suppose that's where I have the greatest confidence, is that they've successfully, one way or another, and unexpectedly to many, managed to get that 30 years of peace and security across the region without any internal conflicts between ASEAN member states. So I suppose that's where I lay my highest confidence, which is probably quite surprising to many, in that I should have that much confidence in these particular states. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. Turning to you, Ivy, what's your perspective on this, as someone, you know, grew up in Malaysia and now living in Taipei?
Sure, thank you, Bill. So I would say that I'm very concerned about the impact of the US-China rivalry. And the first thing that comes to my mind is obviously the South China Sea issue, especially the standoff that we are seeing at Second Thomas Shaw in recent weeks. So as we know, Southeast Asia has been actually largely successful in terms of navigating some of this great power rivalry in the region. It has resisted the pressures to choose sides, and to, you know, it has somewhat managed to balance its relations with both US and China, still engaging China despite the threat that China posed on South China Sea. But this pace is becoming narrower, and I think that the changing dynamics in the US-China rivalry, as well as the threat perceptions from the Southeast Asia country, has escalated some of these tensions. And if we look at the case of Second Thomas Shaw, we can arguably say that China's assertiveness is not necessarily something that is new, but because of Philippines' shift in Philippines' posture under President Marcos, where the Philippines' anxieties over China's threat, both in South China Sea, as well as the increasing prospect of a Taiwan contingency, of which Philippines is geographically very close to. This has led to Philippines strengthening its defense engagement with the US. and including the additional sites under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. And I think this has in turn made China unhappy. And I think that some of China's recent actions at Second Thomas Shaw can also be intended as a warning towards Philippines, because we know that China has for a long time believed that some of this show of strength is important to deter some of the behaviors from the claimant states that China perceives as undesirable. And we know that this is also not targeting just on Philippines, but also can be a signal to Washington, that perhaps it should pull back Philippines in that regard. So I think there is certainly elevated risk, especially because of the nature of US-Philippines defense alliance, and US has already repeatedly affirmed its commitments under the MTD, and it's definitely a space that we should watch closely.
So that's a real example of how US-China rivalry over Taiwan is already having an impact on the Philippines and through the South China Sea issue. Ben, how about you? Are you concerned?
Just on the South China Sea and Taiwan question, I might take a slightly different tack just to ask a bigger question, really. I mean, isn't the South China Sea disputes more of a security concern for Southeast Asian states than for the US and China? I mean, the US has no claim in the South China Sea ultimately. So I wonder about that. But I guess the concern that I'd flag is to do with economics, building maybe on what Nobu was saying at the start. We live in this world where the US and European governments, Japan, Korea, talking about de-risking. And I think that does imply a kind of decoupling, which is the word they don't want to use in certain areas. So we're seeing it in 5G, in AI. And I think that is going to force a lot of Southeast Asian economies to make choices, not one choice. But if you're going to have Huawei, it's probably going to limit your ability to work with the US on other technological questions. If you're going to work with Chinese AI companies, it is going to limit the extent to which US companies are going to work with you. If you're going to have Chinese companies mining and processing your nickel, as in the case of Indonesia, it will make it difficult for Indonesia to collaborate with US and maybe eventually European car companies. So I think there are going to be some really tough choices on the economic front. And I think when I look around Southeast Asia at the different leaders, that's what they're almost animated by, is growing their economy, creating jobs for their people. And I think instead, we often hear this glib talk that US-China competition on the economic front means, Southeast Asian states can play them off against each other and get lots of benefits. I think on these economic questions, it's increasingly is going to be zero sum on certain questions, not on everything. And then I'll just leave you with one further concern, that when it comes to the US and China, in a way, we seem to be in a bit of a race between Chinese economic decline in the long term, not the short term, and US political decline, which is maybe more short to medium term. So maybe the US-China won't be the issue in 20 years' time, because US politics is going to eat itself and the Chinese economy might fizzle out. But those are more big questions than certainties.
The optimistic view there, Ben. Actually, Ben, can I stay with you? I mean, because we have a real example of how countries are managing this divide this week with President Xi's visit to Vietnam, and some quite interesting outcomes from that visit in terms of the choreography and the statement. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's been fascinating to see. I mean, I think in the US, in Europe, in the UK, there's been this perception that Vietnam is some sort of swing state that's in play, and that Vietnam's instincts ultimately lean towards the West, that it's this key pivot to hem in China, because the West does have a China containment strategy. I mean, Xi Jinping has said as much. The West doesn't call it that, but that's what it is. So I think there's been a perception that Vietnam is a key player there for the West to pull over. But I think what all the very nice choreography of the Nguyen Phu Trong, Xi Jinping, state to state and Communist Party to Communist Party summit shows us is that that's not the case at all, that Vietnam does want to maintain its independence. It is wary about China, But in the end, China is its big neighbor to the north. They have the maritime disputes. They also have two parties that are close together. And Vietnam actually has very limited room for maneuver. And I think we've overestimated its room for maneuver. And we also underplay the ideological and political links. So as well as all the choreography around the photos with the wives and Xi Jinping and Wen Fuchuang standing in front of the bamboo tree, symbolizing Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy, which means strong independent roots and flexible branches. It was interesting in the statement to see that they talked about military to military cooperation. They also talked about sort of party to party and intelligence cooperation to combat peaceful evolution, which basically means Westerners trying to destroy communism, to combat color revolutions, splitism, separatism, religious intolerance, by which they mean people having independent religious views. So I think there is a lot of ideological overlap there, as well as the tensions between Vietnam and China. And I think in a way, this symbolizes to me the shrinking of space for Southeast Asian states, which is often presented as the other. Look at, they all have all these choices, but actually it's harder and harder because the US and China are leaning on them more and more.
Thank you. Now, Ivy, I'm going to turn to you next, because I've asked about how concerned you are about Southeast this rivalry, but I'm wondering if you had some thoughts about how concerned Southeast Asian governments themselves are concerned about this rivalry.
Yeah, so I think that without a doubt, the US-China relationship is the most central central consideration when it comes to Southeast Asia government's foreign policy approach. And we talk about how this space is shrinking for Southeast Asia countries because, both the big powers are demanding more and more from Southeast Asia. But I think that in a way, Southeast Asia has been quite skillful, even though this is obviously very hard to achieve. But if we look at this year, there is a flurry of diplomatic activities happening in Southeast Asian capital. Ben have just described the visit of President Xi to Vietnam. And we know that, Vietnam also hosted President Biden just a couple of months ago in September. And it really goes to show the importance that both US and China is attaching to Southeast Asia, especially in a partner like Vietnam. So I think that it's also interesting to note that in the past, we often have this sort of stereotypes that Southeast Asia lean to US as some sort of a security guarantor, whereas Southeast Asia looks to China as sort of an economic collaborator. I think that it's perhaps time that we put a bit of a caveat to this example, because as we've seen, Southeast Asia is increasingly showing more willingness to work with multiple partners, not just the US and also China, and not necessarily in just security realm or economic per se. So I think that's something that's quite interesting. I mean, on top of what Ben has said about Vietnam and China's cooperations on military side of things, we also see that ASEAN has also started to do more militarily with China. There's also an ASEAN China exercise with 5 countries of Southeast Asia countries. So yeah, absolutely. I think that Southeast Asia is increasingly by doing more, it can engage both US and China instead of being pressured into a corner of necessarily choosing one or the other.
Great, thank you. And Nobu, can I turn to you? Any thoughts from your position?
Okay, can I hear me? Great. So I think it really differs by country, and just to oversimplify it here, I think the size matter in Southeast Asia. So if you are a smaller country, of course, the international dynamics matters more. But if you're a bigger country, it's less so. It's simply the fact that, the pie is bigger, right? So no matter how much the US or the China has an influence over certain segments of the country, the pie is really big enough that there will be no domination by one party. So the classic internet IR theory of elite capture doesn't really work on the bigger countries, right? Like, so for example, if you look at the biggest country like Indonesia, no matter how much of a mega project like a high-speed train is there, that doesn't really mean that the whole political establishment is being captured by the Chinese influence. It doesn't matter. But if this is about Laos, you know, the depth ratio of Laos train, a mid-speed train, is far larger in proportion vis-a-vis the whole, you know, the budget or to the GDP. So I think, you know, Southeast Asia, everybody has chosen not to choose, but depending on the size, there are much more space of political choice, and bigger country will definitely have a, you know, an easing time that no matter what the tension is, you know, they have a deep pocket to absorb those tension. And even one sector of economy is really rely on certain side of this, you know, decoupled economy, there's always different segments which you can attribute the GDP growth and so forth. Same goes with the political field and also even the security field too. So I think, you know, for the sake of, you know, this discussion, to simplify it, I think it really depends on the size of the country. The bigger, the tension is not that worrisome. The smaller, very worrisome.
Thank you. And ASEAN obviously has countries ranging from Indonesia to Brunei, so it's you have quite a diversity there. Kath, what about you? Do you think that these Southeast Asian countries view things in the same way as us analysts, their governments in particular?
So I'm reminded of a quote from a report by Blacksmond and Raymond that came out in 2017 from the ANU. And they were doing a piece of research on Thailand and interviewed a whole heap of military and other experts. And one of their findings was our respondents saw the military threat from the US as greater than any other country, than any other great power, including China. Now, that was 2017, so we had a very different geopolitical space, both in Southeast Asia and in the rest of the world. But I think it's really useful to sort of say that if they're viewing the rivalry as being a source of huge concern, it isn't just, as we might tend to discuss, that they're viewing China as a threat, but also that they're viewing what the US is doing as being hugely problematic. But I would also say that I think Ivy used the phrase elevated risk. And I think this is something else to think about. You know, we've just wrapped up the end of COP28. And for many of these states, I would argue that there is a hierarchy of other risks, of which the US-China rivalry is one, but climate-related disasters are extremely high on this set of risks. And therefore, if you can get solar panels more cheaply from China because you can make use of the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement in order to stabilize the electricity supply in your country, then that's probably going to be further up that hierarchy of risks than the sort of potential existential crisis between the US and China. I mean, Nobu did a great job of sort of simplifying things. I mean, one thing that I would say that complicates that is it isn't just about your size, it's about your natural resources, your level of development, and the skills within your population. How much can you soak up some of the movement of companies into Southeast Asia that are trying to hedge away from just having a factory or an operation within China? So I think there are sort of some other complicating factors in how each individual country would assess whether they're concerned or not concerned. But I also think that goes back to something that Nobu said earlier about ASEAN focusing on economics within each individual country and development within each individual country, because all of that is part of, are you going to be able to make a choice? I mean, Ben put forward a great outline of you make choices. If you haven't got a digital infrastructure or you need support to develop a digital infrastructure and Huawei is the one that's offering it at a price that you can afford, then actually that's not a choice. And it doesn't mean that you're not concerned. And those two things, I think, often get confused in that countries are not naively going into some of these deals. They know the risks. They are concerned about some of the risks, but they have limited opportunities to make an alternative choice. And so I think that's useful to sort of frame lots of the things that people have already said.
Thank you. Ivy, can I ask you maybe to continue that theme? This idea that I think as Ben has said, and I think Kath was talking there, that that a lot of people thought, oh, this will be a great time for Southeast Asia. They can play off one side against the other, and they can get benefits from both. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think some level of competition can be good for Southeast Asia, because, from a security perspective, obviously this competition is what kept Southeast Asia from falling into a sort of a unipolar order, right? Whereas I think because of the competitions, there are also more offers on the table for Southeast Asia. We're seeing that, there was a very commonly perceived complaint among Southeast Asia about US engagement is that there was not enough economic element to it, and that following China's BRI, that we have seen the US actually step up. It has actually offered some economic initiative, and the biggest one being IPEF, even though I think the details still need to be sorted out. So yes, I think that some level of competition is good for Southeast Asia, but it is when this competition come to a sort of a clash in a way where Ben has described, where certain choices have to be made, then Southeast Asia would be in a very tough situation to make these choices. And I think that from a Southeast Asia perspective, and as Kath had alluded to, most of these are really not so much ideological or naive or lack of strategic sort of thinking, but it's really more pragmatic. It's really depends on a case-to-case basis based on the conditions that the particular country is facing, and it's not necessarily political in the choice.
Great, thank you. Noble, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to go to Ben to talk about ASEAN now. And we've had a couple of questions about ASEAN already. I mean, do you think ASEAN as an organization, you talked about this decline of regional thinking, regional interests. So do you think that means sort of ASEAN as a vehicle for, a tool for Southeast Asian governments to sort of manage this this competition is in decline, is less useful? And given that you were just talking about the difference between big countries and small countries, Indonesia is the current chair of ASEAN. 1st of January, it becomes Laos, a small country very much dominated by its relations with China. What do you think will happen over the next 12 months?
Well, I think the next 2-3 months will be the key. I think it's already been, when you pass the torch, I think, if there is a will to, to uphold ASEAN community, I think Indonesia should be helping Laos a lot in agenda setting, very much so, because you need to do a lot of PR, you need to do like political narrative controls. Otherwise, Laos will be facing all the questions about China, right? Which is not at Laos's interest. Laos wants to talk about more development, wants to talk about climate change, but because of the views and the eyes of the international community always focus on the US-China relationship, if they don't manage the agenda, it will be dominated by the external factors, which is the nightmare for an ASEAN chair. Indonesia did well, of course, because it's a big body, government, and they have all the facets of all the presentations, the major gala of everything. They have a great PR strategy. So, they manage the ASEAN view on ASEAN chairperson. But Laos doesn't have that caliber as much as Indonesia do. So if Indonesia feels the kind of the de facto ownership role, I think it will be very promising if Laos is well, supported by Indonesia and be able to set the agenda of this year in a very ASEAN interest way. But let's see what agenda will come up in January 1st, or I don't know when it will be announced. I think that will be the very key. And if that setting is very, solid, that will will prevent the Laos from the narrative of being taken hostage by China and so forth. I think it will be a very successful one. But if not, it's a very dangerous one. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Ben, I'll ask same question to you. And I might just put in a kind of question comment from Victor Mallet here. Hasn't ASEAN always avoided politics and difficult questions? Is that why it's been able to succeed for the last 30 years? Maybe just sort of maybe mix that into your answer.
Thanks, Bill. No, I think Victor makes a good point. I mean, the way I always think about ASEAN is inadequate but indispensable, which is like a lot of other multilateral organizations. These things, if you talk to the people who work in them, are really hard. It's really hard just to organize the meetings, let alone to push forward complex agenda items, even among 10 very diverse governments, let alone much bigger multilateral organizations. So I think that's true. And we can see a good example of that on the South China Sea, that the claimant states have really stopped, to be honest, trying to use ASEAN as the vehicle to make strong statements on the South China Sea, because they know it will just lead to division. So they've reverted to a kind of lowest common denominator, which I think is practically quite smart, right? Let's not let that be the issue that breaks up our unity. It's better to be a bit more unified and have slightly less ambitions. So I think there's something quite practical there, which kind of relates to what Ivy said, that it's not naivety or putting your head in the sand or the water, I guess you might say, but it's actually a practical understanding of the limitations of the regional organization, which I think gets me onto the second important point, that there's so much hype about ASEAN within Southeast Asia and outside, and everyone keeps banging on about ASEAN centrality and the like, but just look at the facts of what ASEAN is, okay? It's an association of Southeast Asian nations, but actually it's not. It's ASEAG. It's an association of Southeast Asian governments, because it's not really got anything to do with the people. It's about the governments. And ASEAN can't be more than what the governments who are members of it want it to be. So they deliberately keep the secretariat small. They keep the budget small, not because they don't know what they're doing and they need foreign experts to tell them. They don't want to delegate authority to a supranational kind of secretariat. They want an intergovernmental association, which is why the chair is so important. And if we're honest, to be honest, with Laos, as with some of the other smaller member states, their challenge in a chairmanship year is holding the meetings, right? So normally there's 2 leaders summits every year in ASEAN, and usually for Laos, they'll reduce it to 1, because they simply don't have the bureaucratic, diplomatic, and other logistical capability to have 2 leaders summits. So that is the level of complexity we're talking about for some of the smaller countries. But that's a good thing for ASEAN member states to recognize their limitations and to keep some degree of unity and make sure the organization is focused on what they want. That's a good thing. The problem is that, ASEAN itself and Southeast Asian leaders, as well as outsiders, always talk up what it is much more than the reality, which I think then leads to this confusion. They've promised to be a convening power and they've promised to be an economic community, so why are they failing? But actually, if you read between the lines of the resources they're putting into ASEAN and the powers they're delegating it to it, that's not what they want at all.
Great, thank you. I was wondering if I could turn to Ivy. I mean, we've seen some of the language of China here kind of evolving into talking about community of shared future, and these sort of phrases, sort of developing the ideas behind Belt and Road. And are we seeing Southeast Asian countries kind of signing up to these things in terms of a kind of an overall Chinese vision of the region?
Okay, thank you, Bill. Before I answer that, can I just chime in a little bit on the ASEAN question? So yes, I think that as Nobu has explained, I think that one of the key weakness of ASEAN is that it has a different chair every year, and there's often not enough continuity between the different chair. And I recently thought that what Indonesia has came up for the Myanmar issue. So essentially, Indonesia is proposing a troika kind of a mechanism to resolve the Myanmar issue. And I thought that was a very interesting proposal. So the idea is basically that the past, present, and future chair would actually form a troika to resolve this issue. And I wonder if that is something that perhaps ASEAN can think about for issues that are beyond just Myanmar issue, that could be an interesting sort of a mechanism that ASEAN can use to solve some of these questions about sort of difference in terms of capability and also continuity. So yeah, so and just to segue to your questions about community of shared future, and I think that you would see that this is actually a language that are quite familiar within the ASEAN community. ASEAN likes to say that it is a community. So I think in that sense, this language fits very well in terms of ASEAN's thinking. But I don't think that ASEAN or Southeast Asian country, for the matter, is I think they're aware of what is behind some of this sort of language, that it is, if it means that it is a community that is going to be dominated by China, and I don't think that this is something that Southeast Asia would agree to, even though we do see that Southeast Asia country has very much been involved in China's BRI projects, and they are still showing support to a certain extent towards this China's initiative. But I think essentially ASEAN would still like to retain its own centrality and its own agency in terms of determining some of the agenda that is important for it.
Thank you. Ben, looks like you've got something to add on that point.
Yeah, thanks. Just on the community of common destiny or shared future. I mean, I think there is, as Ivy's saying, there is something interesting there that China is trying to assert a different view of the region. And what was interesting to me is actually a lot of Southeast Asian governments just signed on to it without really thinking much about it, because depending on which English translation you use, it doesn't really sound that scary. You know, who doesn't want a nice, happy future? But interestingly, the Vietnamese Communist Party, which itself obviously is an expert in propaganda work and studying discourse power, was extremely reluctant to sign on to this language, but in the end felt it had to give some compromise to China to keep them on side. So that's interesting to me. But I think more generally, there are real threats to ASEAN centrality, and ASEAN centrality can't just be asserted. And even if China or America or the EU talks about it, that doesn't mean it exists. And China is one threat, as Ivy was saying, because they do have an alternative vision of some sort of, China-led order, sort of Asia for the Asians, with China kind of in the vanguard. But also, if we're honest, there's other formations, the Quad with US, Japan, India, Australia. There's other things going on. The G7, in the way that they talk a lot about the Indo-Pacific now. There are other constellations that threaten to kind of undermine that convening power. But at the same time, interestingly, the US, China, even the UK, all desperate to get a seat at the ASEAN table. So it's interesting that there is still a lot of convening power, but I think that centrality is under threat from various formats and various initiatives around the world.
Thank you. Now, Kath, I'm going to ask a question to you about building on from what Ben was just talking about, Quad. For those who don't know, the India, Japan, US, Australia quadrilateral. The role of outside powers, do you think they can play a useful role in ameliorating this US-China rivalry in Southeast Asia? Or do you think they just make things worse?
So my sitting on the fence answer is It depends on the power and it depends on what they're doing. I mean, one of the things that I think has been quite interesting is to watch how Australia's relationship with Southeast Asia has been evolving, particularly with Penny Wong as the foreign minister, given how much time she spent sort of going to these states. And one of the things that I was told in the summer is one of the interesting things that Australia has sort of slightly modified is to not necessarily be talking so much about shared values. Because if you're sat in certain Southeast Asian states, you might be concerned that Australia is only going to support you if you have certain shared values. And instead, they've sort of adopted a shared interests language, which is potentially a lot more comfortable for a number of these states. But the Australians have also seemingly engaged a little bit more with what are the major concerns of lots of these states. So things like there was lots of talk in the summer about a solar energy connection between Australia and Indonesia, so that you can provide energy from Australia and solar power into Indonesia. And I think actually engaging at that level with what are the concerns within member states of ASEAN and really trying to connect with specific, I think Ivy used the word pragmatic issues, has been really positive in terms of some of the work that the Australians have done. Now, I'll caveat that with Australia might not necessarily view itself as an outside power in all of these conversations. But I think where other outside powers have engaged, it's been a lot more of the sort of high level, we want to engage with ASEAN without actually thinking through what is ASEAN going to achieve, and could we do something better in terms of bilateral relationships that are much more specific. And with this, I'm thinking very heavily about the UK in terms of, I think there are many more connections that the UK could provide. Support for digital infrastructure. The UK has vast resources that it could be providing and sharing expertise and knowledge about within the region. The UK could also be working to support lots of Indigenous programs and activities to do with climate resilience and humanitarian support. It may not be the leader, it may be working with countries to hear what they actually want the UK and others to do, rather than it being an externally imposed agenda for the outside power as to what they want to achieve within the region. And so I think there's been a lot of difference in terms of how the external or outside powers have actually engaged. And so you get a very nuanced picture of whether it's been good or bad, or whether it's going to feed the rivalry or try to nullify it.
Thank you. Nobu, I'm going to ask you this same question now. I wonder whether you would offer a Japanese perspective on the involvement of outside powers, or stand back and look at it sort of from the perspective of the region. And then Ivy, I'll come to you after Nobu.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I'm in Japan, so let me talk from the Japanese point of view. I think there's a very resounding feeling of proximity vis-a-vis the Southeast Asia. This is not just about the economic investment relationship, but recently with all the tourism coming in, and not just outbound but inbound tourism that pretty much familiarize our neighbor community to students, like in all layers of society. I think Japan has been felt Southeast Asia as a very close friend. And also, there's so much more Japanese living in Southeast Asia, which becomes a kind of a de facto political constituency that influences Japanese, foreign policy. It's really indispensable for Japan. I mean, Japan is not as big as it used to be. And I think the Japanese leadership also understand Japan's geopolitical value lies not as a sole Japan per se, but with its linkage with Southeast Asia. So, both in terms of social relationship and political calculation, there is a very strong consensus between Japan and Southeast Asia. We need to walk together, right? I think this will be very much being announced with the Japan Southeast Asia ASEAN Special Summit this weekend. We're hosting all the 10 leaders coming to Tokyo, and I think that really shows. I mean, despite of all the Japanese political dynamics right now, there is a very strong layers, not just in the top leadership, but the economic leadership, even the social leadership. There is a layers, and I think it's very strong in that sense. So what that counts, I think there will be an always kind of a partnership that will cement the kind of legitimacy. So it's not necessarily military power or economic power or legal power, but there is a shared sense of what's legitimate in this region. We have a common kind of great layers of common understanding of what is legitimate. So if China does something like unilateral, like even whether it's legal or illegal, we have partnership that we can talk about whether this is legitimate or not. The same with the United States, when we talk about WTO or whatever, in a trade relationship, if something that US does, and if we consider this is not really legitimate, be it legal or illegal, we have a partner that we could set up a kind of a platform of legitimacy. And then I think that is a very strong political asset in both sides, for Japan side and also Southeast Asia side. Southeast Asia side, you need some external partners. And if you have to deal with the superpowers like China and United States, maybe it's Japan, Australia, India, you could pick one, but at least Japan will be very close by, standing close. So I think that will be a big asset for Southeast Asia and also for Japan as well. So that's what I see right now.
Great, thank you. Ivy, can I put the same question to you? What role do you see for other outside powers, Japan, the UK, EU, whatever, whoever they may be?
Okay. So I absolutely agree that there's a lot that can be done in terms of in the technology sphere, in terms of clean energy and development agenda in general that Catherine has described. I'll just perhaps confine my suggestions to the more security realm. So I think that there is definitely a lot more that external powers can do in terms of helping Southeast Asia to build up its self-defense capability, and especially in the maritime security. I think that in recent years, we have definitely seen more willingness on Southeast Asia's part to work with external powers, middle powers especially, as long as the sort of cooperation or collaboration does not come across as sort of a overly anti-China sort of tone. And I'm particularly thinking about the Japan's OSA that have just been announced. I think that it can play a pretty interesting role. I think that there has quite a bit has been announced already for Malaysia and Philippines. And also, one specific suggestion that I thought could be interesting is that there can be more sharing of best practices or lesson learned in terms of tackling gray zone activities. And this especially could be a meaningful exchange between Japan, Taiwan, and Philippines, given that these are the three parties that have really been dealing a lot with the gray zone activities in their waters. And certainly, I think that continue to call out some of Chinese action can also have a deterrent effect. So I think that we have seen Philippines employing quite a effective public sort of campaign in terms of what China is doing in South China Sea. And also we see that US have released some of the declassified images and videos. So some of these action can be useful in terms of helping Southeast Asia to defend itself and also to sort of keep sort of help it to defend itself against China's aggressions. But obviously, bearing in mind that this is also a fine line to walk between pressuring China and also sort of forcing it into a corner.
Thank you, Ivy. Ben, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, just some thoughts on the UK and then some thoughts on how to make ASEAN cooperation with outside partners more effective. So I was struck when Nobu was saying in Japan, there's sort of unity on the importance of engaging in Southeast Asia, despite sort of domestic political tensions and the like. And it struck me that that's very much not the case in the UK, the newest dialogue partner for ASEAN. And you know, this engagement with ASEAN is something that's new. And obviously the ruling Conservative Party has sort of badged it as part of their Indo-Pacific tilt. And because it's very much seen as a conservative initiative, I think we've seen the opposition Labour Party, which is very likely, according to polls, to form the next British government sometime in the next year, has been at least lukewarm, if not even quite skeptical about heightened engagement in Asia and the role that the UK can play. So I think it's quite important, if the UK is to succeed, that we can demonstrate to Southeast Asian partners that we have a kind of long-standing desire to increase our engagement that is bipartisan. And yeah, I mean, in the background, I've been urging people in the Labour Party to think more about it and publicly too, because I think there is a nice Labour story that they could write about the importance of multilateralism, and ASEAN is a really good example of that, the importance of engaging on climate change and other practical issues. So I hope that Labour can lean in rather than lean against this, but I think we'll have to see. The other good thing for Labour is that actually, you know, they say they want more Europe, but when you go to Brussels or Paris, or you go to Berlin, you know, the European Union is also very focused on the Indo-Pacific and engaging more with Southeast Asia and ASEAN in particular, given it's a similar, although quite different kind of body. So I don't think it's an either-or question, which brings me on to how to make the cooperation more effective. One thing is that the truly like-minded countries, and I think we can say the G7 are those, need to coordinate their activities better, which doesn't mean doing everything together or appearing to gang up on Southeast Asian partners, but at least, you know, if the French are going to fund a maritime security workshop on Tuesday, please don't let the Brits or the Australians do on the same day or the next day, do it, you know, a few months later. So I think there's something that, you know, G7 countries as countries that can talk very honestly to each other can do to better coordinate all our limited resources to make sure that we're not duplicating. That's one thing. Secondly, I think what we need from partners in the region is more honesty and a more honest dialogue, because often I know from people who are in the room, these conversations between ASEAN and its dialogue partners are very stilted, just reading out formal statements. Countries from the outside will often say to Southeast Asian partners or ASEAN Secretariat, what do you want? And they'll say, well, we want whatever you offer. And then, what do you want to offer? We want to offer whatever you want. And it goes kind of nowhere. And if these kind of cooperation projects are actually going to be useful rather than just tokenistic photo opportunities and a waste of taxpayer money in very straitened financial times, we need more honesty both ways. And that requires more trust. And that's quite hard, but showing up would help. So I hope the Brits continue to show up when we have maybe a new government. And obviously it would be good if the Americans show up, but maybe not if Trump is president. That's my view anyway.
Thank you. Okay, I haven't got much time, and I want to ask people about Myanmar. A couple of questions from Tata Hla and Grace O'Neill asking, how does US-China rivalry affect the Myanmar question? I'm looking for enthusiastic faces. Nobu, come on. Any thoughts on how Myanmar might be affected by this rivalry? I mean, to me, it's, you know, at the outset after the coup, it looked like this was one issue that the US and China could possibly work together on, but somehow it hasn't worked out like that.
That's $1 million question. I wish I have an answer to that. I mean, the tentative conclusion is we really need to wait until the power consolidation in Myanmar. But you know, how rough that process is going to be, we wouldn't be able to stay idle. So it's a tough call. I'm not so sure whether the US-China tension really matter that much, because I would say it is very much a domestic, and I think both US and China is not playing a pivotal role in which way the power dynamic goes. I mean, it could be Russia could be one, India could be, but not that much what I see. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see that US and China is playing that pivotal role. So it's a different dynamic, and which also is tells us that Southeast Asian, key political dynamic doesn't necessarily happen because of US-China relationship. The Southeast Asia in itself has lots of, still a nation building process, like Myanmar is in some parts of, say, Indonesia too. State building, of course, but nation building as well. So I think it is an alarming case that, we have to fine tune our lens when there's a conflict. Is this a very local, regional, global, which context this is happening on? And my conclusion is that this is not a great power relationship, phenomenon. So that's why I don't have a clear answer to the question whether, US-China relationship fills into this one.
Thanks. Ivy, any thoughts on this?
Well, I think that the Myanmar issue is unfortunately not very high on sort of the global agenda right now, and it doesn't seem like it is very high and getting a lot of attention from the US, unfortunately. And then if we look at China, I think China's interest in Myanmar is mainly that there will be peace and stability because it is one of its closest neighbor. But I think in recent months, we see, especially with the incidents in the northern Myanmar, we see that another of China's priority right now is to clamp down on some of the telecommunication crime, or sort of like this fraud operations that is happening at the border between China and Myanmar right now. And we know that so I think that China is sort of taking a slightly more I guess you could say pragmatic, or perhaps a more agenda-based approach when it comes to Myanmar, and not necessarily in terms of the democracy of Myanmar in general. And then obviously we also see that ASEAN has not been able to also move much on the agenda. So I think, unfortunately, that Myanmar, as important as it is to ASEAN as an issue, it is really sort of falling in between the gaps in terms of the attention span of the regional powers.
Great, thank you. Now we're almost at the end, but maybe I'll give you a minute just to sort of throw in any sort of thoughts you've had during the seminar, and make some conclusion thoughts. Should we do the same order at the beginning? Shall we begin with Nobu? Are you okay? Any things that have sprung to mind, or you just wanted to say before we go?
Yes. I have one thing that I think it requires attention. I think that's the inequality issue. I think that should be like, has been put, as you mentioned about the hierarchy of threats and risk. I think inequality is pretty much high on top. Whether we want to think about ASEAN collective action, inequality among the countries will be very risky. That will diverge their interests. Inequality within the country will put all the democracies into dysfunctional political process, and also turn their back onto globalization or international cooperation. And also, all these, the wave of digitalization could, which if this will accelerate the inequality, we could see more identity politics coming in. You have religious problems like the radicalism and everything. You lose faith on, nation states. You name it. You can name all these inequality origin, issues that in the history of Southeast Asia we already saw. And I think if we are mindful of that, we could always make sure external powers like Japan or the UK and everyone, we could really always address that inequality issues and make sure that we don't only go with the market, bankability interest only, but with this kind of reclaim the public, reclaim the common asset within the region is the role of the great power and also the external power that we could really, kind of incentivize and also support. And I think it is for the benefit, not only for Southeast Asian countries, but also for us, the external partners as well. So I think, we really need to put the inequality issues at the top of our interests in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Ben. And then we'll go to Kath.
Yeah, just very quickly, a suggestion on Myanmar of something that obviously in a very, very difficult situation might be helpful, but is difficult to pull off. I think a lot of outside powers and ASEAN have said, oh, ASEAN must take the lead on the 5-point consensus on Myanmar, but we know that's not moving forward. And we also know that many ASEAN member states don't actually have much interests or leverage over Myanmar. And there are outside powers like Japan and Korea with a lot of investments, China with a long border and a lot of interests, as Ivy's outlined. Also the UK, US, EU with historic and other connections. So I actually think what would be helpful would be for ASEAN member states and those key dialogue partners to come together to talk about how to deal with the practical problems, like getting humanitarian assistance in to the people who need it and not through the junta, to talk about the differing approaches they're taking and how to move to some sort of more stable, hopefully, solution in future. I think that would be useful. It would be difficult to organize, and maybe it's better sort of done behind closed doors than in the public eye. But I think there would be something useful that could come out of that. Although in the end, as Nobu said, the future of Myanmar is going to be decided by this fight between democratic forces and a murderous junta.
Thank you, Kath, and then Ivy.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and just run through three things. One of them is, one of the things we haven't mentioned is the sort of language coming from certain commentators, especially those in the United States, suggesting that at some point Southeast Asian states are going to have to choose. And I think that's one of the biggest risks, is putting states in a position where they have to make a choice. Partly because I don't think we understand which way all of them would choose. And I think it could vary considerably from the set of expectations. I think that links me to something Ben said earlier about honesty and showing up. I think I would add on to that, domestically within lots of external powers, there needs to be a lot more knowledge and understanding of Southeast Asian states. That includes everything from educational exchanges to languages to opportunities to go and work and live there. And I think this is one of the problems, is if you're turning up and saying, what do you want us to do? It's a reflection that maybe there needs to be more knowledge and understanding on our side. And actually that leads to greater empathy in what you're proposing to do. And I think that's a significant absence from lots of the approaches from particularly from external powers. And my final point goes back to something that Nobu mentioned about Myanmar, which is it is very easy to overstate how many of these relationships are informed or determined by understanding it just through the lens of US-China. Southeast Asia does have lots of its own dynamics. I think Ivy mentioned earlier the importance of understanding different risks. I think all of this goes to the US-China relationship, and the US-China rivalry is important, but it's not going to necessarily overly determine lots of these other dynamics that are important for the region.
Thank you. Ivy, a quick last word, please.
Okay. So yeah, I think that to manage the risks that are posed by great power rivalry, obviously we need to manage the US-China relations better. And we are seeing some positive signs. But I think that that's something that perhaps Southeast Asia could not necessarily directly influence, but I think that all of us could perhaps nudge and signal to the two powers that, we do want. It is very important for the two great powers to stabilize in their relation. And so to the point that Catherine made about, this pressure to choose side, I think there needs to be an awareness that it is not really in the West's interest that Southeast Asia choose side, because that would lead to a disability. And the fact that Southeast Asia has been stable for so many years is exactly this equilibrium that we are in, and the fact that Southeast Asia has resisted the pressure of choosing side.
Great. Thank you very much to all four of you for taking part today, and thank you to the audience for your questions and participation. Chatham House is an independent policy institute and a trusted forum for debate and dialogue, so thank you for being part of that. Just a reminder that this is the first event in a three-part series held in partnership with Japan House London. 2 further events will take place in the new year. One will be online like this, and another one in person at Japan House in West London. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.